A ballroom can forgive a ruined fortune, a broken engagement, even a whispered scandal, but it never forgives a man it has chosen to fear. For 7 years, no one had danced with Duke Alexander Whitmore. Not once. Not at Almack's. Not at the governor's winter reception. Not beneath the gilded ceilings of Newport's grand summer houses. And certainly not inside Whitmore Hall, where every crystal chandelier burned as though trying to melt the cold that had settled into the stone. On that December evening, the mansion stood above the Hudson like a dark crown, its tall windows glowing amber against the snow, its marble steps swept clean, its iron gates opened for the first great ball since the Duke had returned from the war, with half his reputation buried and the other half carved into silence. Music spilled through the ballroom in bright, disciplined waves, violins rising over the murmur of silk gowns, polished shoes, and polite lies. Ladies in pale satin moved like candle flames. Gentlemen laughed softly behind white gloves. Silver trays passed from hand to hand. Everything was beautiful. Everything was arranged. Everything obeyed the old rules of wealth, rank, and fear. Then Alexander appeared at the top of the staircase, and the entire room forgot how to breathe. He did not pause for effect. He had never needed spectacle. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black evening clothes that seemed cut from the same darkness as the winter beyond the glass, he descended with the grave composure of a man who had survived far worse than judgment. The left side of his face caught the candlelight first, revealing the pale line of the scar that ran from his temple toward his jaw. Not grotesque, not monstrous, but unmistakable. A mark society had turned into a story before it ever asked him for the truth. A fan snapped shut somewhere near the refreshment table. A young woman drew back half a step. An older matron lowered her eyes as though mercy could be performed by refusing to look. Alexander reached the bottom of the stairs and stood beneath the chandelier, one gloved hand resting lightly at his side, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes moving over the crowd with the tired patience of someone who already knew the verdict. The musicians began a waltz. Couples formed quickly, almost too quickly. Men bowed. Ladies smiled. Skirts swept across the floor in circles of blue, ivory, rose, and gold. Within less than a minute, every eligible woman had found a partner. Every one except the Duke. He remained alone at the edge of the light, master of the house, owner of every polished inch beneath their feet, and still the one man no one dared touch. Near the south windows, Miss Emma Bennet watched him with bright, restless eyes that missed very little. She was not the kind of woman society expected to change a room. She had no grand title, no fortune hidden behind lace, no mother scheming from a velvet chair. She had come as companion to Lady Margaret Hale, and most people had noticed her only because she was too pretty to be invisible and too lively to behave as though poverty had swallowed her spirit. Chestnut curls framed her fair face in soft rebellion against the pins meant to tame them. Her green eyes carried warmth, intelligence, and a spark of mischief that even hardship had failed to extinguish. All evening she had smiled when spoken to, laughed gently at dull remarks, and moved with the quick grace of someone who had learned to make herself useful in rooms that did not make space for her. But now she was still, because she saw what the others refused to see. Not a beast, not a warning, not a ruined man dressed in fine black wool. She saw a person standing alone while 100 people pretended the cruelty was manners. The beast of Whitmore has returned, a woman whispered behind her fan, low enough to be called discreet and loud enough to wound. Emma's fingers tightened around her glass. Lady Margaret, seated beside her, gave the smallest sigh. Do not involve yourself, child. Society has already decided what he is. Emma looked across the ballroom at Alexander Whitmore, at the rigid line of his shoulders, at the way he accepted loneliness without granting it the dignity of visible pain. The music turned, sweet and merciless. Another circle of dancers passed before him, laughing as though he were part of the furniture, part of the shadow, part of the house's tragic decoration. Something in Emma's chest lifted, not reckless exactly, but clear. She set down her glass. Then society may survive being disappointed tonight, she said softly. Before Lady Margaret could stop her, Emma stepped away from the window and crossed the ballroom. The laughter thinned first, then the whispers, then even the music seemed to tremble around her. Alexander saw her coming and his expression hardened at once. not with anger, but with disbelief sharpened by long practice. Emma did not slow. She walked through the candlelight in her modest cream gown, beautiful, bright-eyed, and impossibly alive among all that careful fear. When she reached him, she lowered herself into a graceful curtsy, lifted her gaze to his, and offered her hand as if the entire room had not just turned to stone. "Your Grace," she said, her voice warm enough to disturb the winter in his eyes. "May I have this dance?" For one suspended breath, no one moved. Emma Bennet's hand remained lifted between them, small, steady, and impossible to ignore. Duke Alexander Whitmore looked down at it, as though she had offered him something far more dangerous than a dance. Around them, the ballroom held its silence with almost religious devotion. 100 faces turned. 100 judgments waited. The candles trembled in their silver branches, and beyond the tall windows, snow pressed against the glass like a pale witness. Alexander's gray eyes returned to Emma's face. Up close, she saw the scar more clearly. The thin, pale-lined society had transformed into a legend, and the living man beneath it, controlled, wounded, and colder than the marble beneath their feet. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "you do not understand what you are doing." There was no threat in the words. That surprised her. There was only warning. Emma's smile did not falter, though a bright flush touched her cheeks. "I believe I am asking for a waltz, Your Grace." Something unreadable moved through his expression. "They will not forgive you for it." Her fingers remained extended. "Then they are poor keepers of forgiveness." A faint rustle passed through the crowd, impatience mixed with disbelief. Lady Margaret shifted in her chair near the windows, one gloved hand pressed anxiously over her fan. Two young ladies near the refreshment table leaned toward each other, their whispers sharp as needles. Alexander heard them. Of course he heard them. He had trained himself for years to hear every cruel little sound in a room before it could reach him by surprise. He glanced beyond Emma's shoulder, taking in the frozen dancers, the watchful matrons, the gentlemen pretending not to stare. Then his eyes returned to the woman before him, lively and beautiful in her modest cream gown, her chestnut curls refusing perfect order, her green eyes bright with something he had not seen directed at him in years. Not pity, not curiosity. Resolve. "You should return to your chaperone," he said. Emma tilted her head, and a hint of her natural playfulness flashed through the gravity of the moment. "I have been told I am quite bad at returning when expected." That should not have reached him. It should not have touched anything. Yet the corner of his mouth almost moved, barely, briefly, like a door remembering it had once opened. Then he looked at her hand again. Slowly, with the measured care of a man stepping onto uncertain ice, Alexander lifted his black-gloved hand and accepted hers. The contact was formal, proper, nothing more than courtly etiquette, yet the room reacted as if lightning had crossed the polished floor. A soft gasp rose near the columns. Someone whispered his name. Someone else whispered hers. Emma felt the strength of his hand, controlled but not harsh, and the cold restraint in the way he held himself away from her, as though even closeness required apology. The musicians hesitated. Alexander turned his head slightly. "Play," he commanded, not loudly, but with the authority of a man whose house still remembered who owned it. The violins obeyed. The waltz began again, delicate and uncertain at first, then fuller as Alexander led Emma into the center of the ballroom. She followed with natural grace, lighter on her feet than he expected, her steps quick, confident, and warmed by a quiet joy she made no effort to hide. Around them, the other couples failed to recover. A few tried to resume dancing, but their movements faltered. Most simply watched. Alexander felt every stare land upon the scarred side of his face, every flicker of scandal attaching itself to Emma's name. His jaw tightened. "You have made yourself the subject of tomorrow morning's gossip," he said as they turned beneath the chandelier. Emma glanced up at him, eyes bright. "Only tomorrow morning? I had hoped for at least the entire week." His gaze sharpened, startled by the lightness in her voice. She was not careless. He could see that now. She knew exactly what the room was doing. She simply refused to bow to it. They passed Lady Caroline Mercer near the edge of the floor, radiant in pale blue silk, her smile polished into something beautiful and unkind. Emma noticed the way Alexander's hand stiffened slightly at her presence. She noticed, too, How Lady Caroline looked not at Emma, but at the place where their hands met. Possession, embarrassment, and old resentment crossed the woman's face so quickly that anyone less observant might have missed them. Emma missed very little. "You need not continue," Alexander murmured as they turned away. "I can end this before they make you pay for it." Emma's answer came softly, beneath the music. "Do not let them decide where the music ends." For the first time, Alexander truly looked at her. Not at her rank, not at her gown, not at the social mistake she had willingly become. He looked at her as though her words had reached some locked chamber inside him and disturbed the dust. The waltz carried them on, slow and luminous, through a room too proud to admit it had been shamed by a young woman's courage. Emma smiled then, not broadly, not triumphantly, but with a warmth so alive it seemed almost out of place in Whitmore Hall. And Alexander, who had not danced in 7 years, realized with quiet astonishment that he still remembered how. The waltz ended not with applause, but with a silence so complete that even the final violin note seemed afraid to fade. Emma lowered her hand from Alexander's shoulder, and for one fragile instant, the candlelit world around them disappeared. There was only the polished floor beneath her slippers, the scent of winter roses in the air, and the Duke standing before her, as if he had crossed a great distance without moving more than a few yards. Then the room returned. Whispers stirred like cold leaves. A gentleman near the west column cleared his throat too loudly. A young lady laughed once, sharply, before her mother's fan struck lightly against her wrist in warning. Alexander stepped back and gave Emma a formal bow, precise enough to satisfy every rule, distant enough to rebuild the wall she had just dared to touch. "You dance very well, Miss Bennet," he said. "So do you, Your Grace," Emma replied, her smile bright but gentle. "Despite your best efforts to look as though you had forgotten." His eyes flickered. It was almost amusement, almost pain. Forgetting is sometimes easier than remembering. The words were quiet, but they opened a door he had not meant to leave unguarded. Emma did not press him. She only lowered her gaze for a moment, as if honoring the grief she had glimpsed without demanding its name. That small restraint unsettled him more than boldness would have. Pity would have been simple to reject. Curiosity could have been punished with coldness. But respect had no obvious defense. Across the ballroom, Lady Caroline Mercer watched them with the stillness of a portrait whose paint had begun to crack. 7 years earlier, she had stood in another room, beneath another chandelier, with Alexander Whitmore's ring upon her finger and half of New York society envying her future. Back then, he had been impossible not to admire. Officers greeted him with pride. Mothers praised his manners. Daughters forgot their practiced indifference when he entered. His laughter had been rare, but when it came, it warmed the room like late afternoon sun through tall windows. Caroline had loved that version of him, or at least she had loved being seen beside him. She had loved the name, the attention, the certainty that she would become Duchess of Whitmore before any other woman could claim the prize. Then the war changed the shape of every promise. Alexander returned after months of rumors, not in triumph, but in quiet withdrawal. His letters had stopped first. Then came word that he had been injured while leading men through a field hospital evacuation during a freezing night far from home. No one in society knew the details, and what society did not know, it invented. When Caroline was finally admitted to see him, she found the curtains drawn, the air heavy with medicine and extinguished candles, and Alexander seated near the window with a bandage along the side of his face. He rose when she entered. Even wounded, he tried to stand like a gentleman. For a moment, she saw his hope. That was what haunted him later. Not her fear, not even the way her gloved fingers flew to her mouth. It was the brief, helpless hope in him before she looked away. Within a month, her family announced the engagement had been dissolved by mutual understanding. Mutual. That was the word printed politely in every drawing room and repeated over every breakfast table. No one printed that Caroline had wept before her father, not for Alexander's suffering, but for her own future. No one printed that she had whispered, "No woman will ever look at him without pity again." Alexander heard of it from a cousin too careless with wine and too eager with gossip. He did not confront her. He did not defend himself. He simply stopped attending balls, stopped answering invitations, and let Whitmore Hall become less a home than a monument to all the things a man could survive and still be considered ruined. Now, beneath the same cruel sparkle of society, Emma Bennet stood where Caroline once had. Only Emma did not look away. Caroline saw it. Alexander saw that she saw it. The past and present met across the ballroom like two storms recognizing each other. Emma followed his gaze and found Lady Caroline watching with a smile too delicate to be kind. Is she someone important? Emma asked softly. Alexander's answer came after a pause. She was once expected to be. Emma understood more from what he did not say than from what he did. Her lively expression softened, but did not dim. Then she misjudged the future. Alexander looked down at her, and something in his guarded face shifted, not healed, not opened, but struck by the strange possibility that the world's verdict had never been the same thing as truth. The silence that followed Emma's words did not last, but Alexander carried it with him as he stepped away from her. It settled beneath his ribs like a small, impossible ember, unwelcome because it was warm. Around them, Whitmore Hall slowly remembered its manners. Conversation resumed in careful fragments. Couples drifted back toward the floor. The musicians turned pages as if paper and strings could mend what courage had disturbed. Emma returned to Lady Margaret's side, where the older woman looked at her over the rim of her spectacles with equal parts alarm and admiration. "My dear," Lady Margaret murmured, "you have just handed every drawing room in New York enough gossip to survive the winter." Emma accepted a glass of water from a passing footman and smiled, still breathless from the dance. "Then I have performed a public service." Lady Margaret tried not to smile and failed. "You are far too pleased with yourself." "Not pleased," Emma said softly, her gaze moving back toward Alexander. "Only unwilling to be ashamed." Across the ballroom, Alexander stood near a marble column beneath a portrait of his grandfather, a severe man in military dress whose painted eyes seemed to judge even the candles. Several gentlemen approached the Duke with careful politeness, praised the restoration of the hall, mentioned the weather, complimented the orchestra, and escaped as quickly as dignity allowed. Their wives did not approach at all. Alexander answered each remark with flawless courtesy. He had become very skilled at making others comfortable with their own cowardice. Yet his attention kept returning to Emma Bennet. She was laughing now at something Lady Margaret had said, a bright, quick sound that rose above the muted conversation and vanished before it could be called improper. It was not the practiced laugh of a society girl trained to flatter. It was alive, unafraid. It made the ballroom feel briefly less like a museum of old judgments and more like a place where people might still be saved from themselves. He disliked that. Thought at once. Salvation was a word for sermons, not men who had learned to live without expectations. "You seem captivated, Whitmore." The voice slid beside him with the softness of silk over a blade. Alexander did not turn immediately. Lady Caroline. She stood near him in pale blue satin, golden hair arranged with mathematical elegance, diamonds at her throat catching more light than warmth. Her smile was perfect. It always had been. "I must congratulate you," she said. "The evening has become far more memorable than anyone anticipated." "That was never my intention." "No, I imagine very little has been your intention these past years." The words were light, but the cruelty beneath them was expertly dressed. Alexander looked at her then, and the scar along his face drew a faint flicker from her eyes. Not fear. Worse, familiar discomfort. "Did you come to discuss the success of my ball, or to inspect whether I still frighten your friends?" Caroline's smile tightened. "Must you make everything so severe?" "I learned from careful teachers." For the first time, color touched her cheeks. She glanced toward Emma, who had begun helping Lady Margaret adjust the lace at her cuff, cheerful and unguarded despite the weight of 100 opinions pressing toward her. "She is pretty," Caroline said, in a provincial sort of way. "Lively, too. Men often mistake liveliness for depth when they have been lonely." Alexander's gloved hand closed once at his side, then relaxed. "You are speaking of a guest in my house. I am warning you as an old friend. We were never old enough to become friends." Caroline's eyes sharpened. Before she could answer, a bell chimed softly from the corridor, and servants opened the tall doors to the supper room. The crowd moved with relief, grateful for ritual, for motion, for anything that could carry them away from the discomfort of having witnessed kindness. Emma remained near Lady Margaret until the press of bodies separated them for a moment. She found herself beside a long table dressed with white linen, winter fruit, sugared almonds, and silver bowls of punch that reflected the chandeliers in broken gold. A young woman she did not know gave her a smile that was all teeth and no welcome. "Miss Bennet, is it?" "Yes." "How brave of you to dance with His Grace. I suppose fear is easier to misplace when one has so little to lose." The remark landed gently enough to pass as wit, but Emma felt its edge. She lifted her glass, her green eyes bright. "Perhaps, though I have noticed those with the most to lose are often the quickest to surrender it." The young woman blinked, unsure whether she had been insulted. Emma smiled sweetly and moved on. Yet the words found Alexander from across the room, and he nearly forgot to breathe. He had expected her to shrink after the dance. Instead, she moved through contempt like a candle refusing to apologize for its flame. Then his gaze fell to her hand as she reached for a folded napkin near the edge of the table. A small silver locket had slipped from beneath her glove, swinging briefly at her wrist. Upon it was engraved a name he had not seen in 7 years. Dr. Thomas Bennet. The room seemed to narrow. The music, the gossip, the glittering supper table all drew back like a tide. Alexander knew that name. He knew it from a winter field hospital, from a night of smoke, prayer, and snow, from a letter he had written and never sent because grief had already taken too much from the daughter left behind. Emma turned and found him staring. For the first time all evening, it was not his scar that held the room's secret. It was hers. Emma's fingers closed around the silver locket before she fully understood why Alexander's face had changed. Until that moment, she had seen him guarded, distant, wounded, even briefly amused, but not shaken. Now the great Duke of Whitmore looked as though a door had opened beneath his feet. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. The question was not rude, yet it carried such weight that Emma forgot the room around them. "It belonged to my father." Alexander's gaze lifted from the locket to her face. "Dr. Thomas Bennet was your father?" "Yes." Her bright expression softened at once, though the liveliness did not leave her eyes. It changed into something braver. "Did you know him?" The supper room continued its glittering. Motion around them. Silverware chimed. Ladies spoke behind fans. Gentlemen compared horses and politics as if the world had not just tilted between two people standing beside a bowl of sugared oranges. Alexander did not answer immediately. His gloved hand rested near the edge of the table, not touching it, as if he needed the discipline of stillness to remain composed. "I knew of him," he said at last. Emma heard the evasion. She had spent too many years listening to polite half-truths from people who believed poverty made a woman easier to deceive. "Your Grace," she said, not sharply, but clearly, "my father has been gone for 7 years. I would rather have an honest sorrow than a courteous silence." The words struck him with almost visible force. For 7 years, Alexander had hidden behind courtesy because courtesy did not tremble. It could stand at the head of a table, answer letters, host a ball, and be mistaken for strength. But Emma Bennet, with her lively eyes and cream gown and wounded inheritance, had just asked him for the one thing he had denied nearly everyone: truth. He looked past her to the tall windows, where snow moved against the glass in restless white shadows. "Your father served in the same medical camp where I was stationed during the last winter of the campaign," he said. He was admired. Emma's mouth curved, small and sad. He would have pretended not to like that. He did. The answer came so quickly that it startled them both. Something like memory softened Alexander's voice. He had a way of dismissing praise as if it were an unnecessary expense. Emma gave a quiet laugh before she could stop herself. It was a warm sound, delicate and sudden, and for one moment the sorrow between them loosened its grip. That was him. He once told a wealthy patient that gratitude was acceptable, but flowers were impractical unless they came with a basket of food. Alexander almost smiled. That also sounds like him. The near smile disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by an old restraint. Emma saw it happen. She saw the wall return, stone by stone. "There is more," she said. He looked at her. "Why do you think that?" "Because people look away when there is more." Before he could reply, Lady Caroline's voice floated toward them from a few feet away, soft and bright enough for others to hear. How touching. A shared acquaintance between His Grace and Miss Bennet. Society is full of charming little coincidences. Emma turned, her locket still held in her palm. Caroline stood with two ladies beside her, each one dressed in the pale confidence of women who had never wondered whether they would be welcome in a room. Her smile rested on Emma like frost on glass. Dr. Bennet was a respectable man, I am sure, Caroline continued, though it is remarkable how far a daughter may rise when sentiment finds the proper staircase. The women beside her gave the faintest laugh. Emma's cheeks warmed, but she did not lower her eyes. She was beautiful in that moment not because she was untouched by humiliation, but because she refused to let it make her small. Alexander's voice cut gently through the laughter. Lady Caroline. She looked at him, satisfied to have drawn him in. Your Grace. Dr. Bennet gave more honor to this country with a medicine bag and a pair of tired hands than most families give it with 10 generations of inherited names. The supper room quieted near them, one conversation at a time. Caroline's smile stiffened. Emma looked at Alexander, stunned by the calm force in his words. He had not raised his voice. He had not accused. Yet every syllable had landed exactly where it was meant to. I meant no offense, Caroline said. Then you are fortunate, Alexander replied. Intentions are easier to repair than character. A hush opened around them. Lady Caroline's eyes flashed, but she had no answer fit for public hearing. She turned away with the grace of someone retreating while pretending to lead. Emma should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt the deeper ache beneath what had just happened. Alexander had defended her father too swiftly, too personally, too painfully. You knew him better than you first admitted, she said when the others drifted back into nervous conversation. Alexander looked down at her, and the candlelight caught the scar along his face, making it seem less like damage than evidence of something endured. Yes, he said. I did. Then tell me. His silence stretched. Emma waited. She had a gift for waiting without surrendering. At last, Alexander spoke so softly that the words belonged only to her. Not here. He glanced toward the ballroom, toward Caroline, toward all the glittering mouths ready to chew truth into scandal. There are things about that winter your father wished to protect, and things I was too ashamed to bring to your door. Emma's breath caught. You came to my door? No, he said, and the regret in his voice was heavier than confession. That is what I have regretted. For the first time that night, Emma's lively courage faltered, not from fear, but from the sudden nearness of a grief she had spent years folding neatly away. Alexander saw it and looked stricken by his own honesty. Outside, the wind moved along the windows. Inside, the music began again, but neither of them turned toward it. Between them, the little silver locket rested in Emma's hand, no longer merely a daughter's keepsake, but a key to a buried winter, a dead doctor's honor, and a duke's silence that had lasted far too long. Alexander did not lead Emma back to the ballroom at once. Instead, he guided her toward the quieter end of the supper room, where a row of arched windows overlooked the frozen gardens and the candlelight thinned into silver. Nothing improper passed between them. He kept a careful distance, his hand never touching more than the air near her elbow, yet the very act of stepping aside with him sent another ripple through the guests. Emma felt the room watching. She also felt, with strange clarity, that she had been watched before in far harsher rooms and had survived them all. They will say I have trapped you in conversation, Alexander said. Then they will be giving me more credit than usual, Emma replied, though her voice was softer now. He looked at her, and the faintest trace of warmth crossed his eyes. You make light of wounds before they can be named. Sometimes it keeps them from ruling the evening. Does it work? She glanced down at the silver locket in her palm. Not always. The honesty settled between them more intimately than any touch. Beyond the glass, snow blew across the formal garden, covering the hedges, the fountains, the dark stone statues that watched the house with blank, patient faces. Emma remembered another winter, less grand and far poorer, when she had sat beside her mother at a kitchen table in Albany, waiting for a letter that did not come. Her father's final trunk had arrived first, then official words folded in cold paper, honorable service, national gratitude, deepest condolences. There had been no story inside those words. No voice. No hand explaining how a man who had once filled a house with laughter could become a line in a report. Years later, Emma had found the unfinished letter hidden beneath the lining of his medical case, written in his strong, slanted hand. In it, he had mentioned a young duke who refused to abandon the injured during a winter evacuation, a man of rare courage whose name had been surrounded by whispers even then. The last sentence had never been finished. If anything happens to me, tell Whitmore that honor is not lost because cowards refuse to recognize it. Emma had read that line so many times the paper had softened at the creases. She had not known what it meant. Not fully. Not until she saw Alexander standing alone beneath his own chandelier, while society punished him for a story it had never bothered to understand. "My father wrote about you," she said. Alexander became very still. "That is not possible." "It is. He left a letter." The color withdrew slightly from his face. "Do you have it?" "Not with me. It is in Lady Margaret's traveling desk. I keep it close when I travel." "Why?" His question was barely audible. Emma closed her fingers around the locket. "Because it is the last place where he sounds alive." Alexander looked away, and for several seconds his profile was turned toward the window, scar and shadow divided by moonlit glass. When he spoke, his voice had lost its ducal polish. "Your father saved more men than any officer whose name was printed in the papers. He worked until his hands shook. He joked when others were afraid. He refused praise. And he made me promise that if his daughter was ever left without protection, I would see that she was not forgotten." Emma's breath caught, but she did not interrupt. "I returned from the campaign in disgrace before I could fulfill it. There were inquiries, accusations, old families protecting old names. By the time I learned where you and your mother had gone, my own name had become a stain. I told myself approaching you would only bring scandal to your door." His mouth tightened with something deeper than regret. It was a coward's comfort dressed as restraint. Emma looked at him for a long moment. In the ballroom beyond them, laughter rose, bright and shallow. Here near the windows, the truth felt heavier, but cleaner. "We were not forgotten by everyone," she said. "Lady Margaret took me in after my mother passed. I have had shelter, work, books, and more lectures on posture than any woman should endure." His expression shifted at that, and despite the ache between them, Emma's lively spirit flickered back. "Do not look so tragic, Your Grace. I am not a ghost from your guilt. I am extremely alive, frequently inconvenient, and very difficult to misplace." A breath almost like a laugh escaped him. It was small, broken at the edges, but real enough to startle them both. Then the ballroom doors opened wider, and Lady Caroline's voice rose above the returning music. "How delightful! The next waltz shall be chosen by the ladies. Surely every woman here must select the partner she believes most worthy." The game sounded innocent. It was not. Emma saw it in the way Caroline's eyes found Alexander, then her. One by one, ladies crossed the floor to claim partners. Smiles bloomed. Fans fluttered. Names were spoken like little coronations. No one approached the Duke. The old cruelty had found a new costume. Caroline waited until the absence became visible, until Alexander stood apart again, until Emma felt the room preparing to enjoy his humiliation. Then Caroline turned, her blue satin shining beneath the chandeliers. "Miss Bennet," she said sweetly, "since you have already shown such unusual courage, perhaps you would not mind rescuing His Grace from solitude once more. You do seem fond of lost causes." "Hey!" Soft wave of laughter moved through the room. Emma felt it strike her, not loudly, but coldly. Alexander's face hardened. He stepped forward, not toward Caroline, but toward Emma, and in that movement the room began to understand that the game had reached the wrong man. The laughter did not last long. It faltered first near the musicians, then beneath the chandeliers, then along the edges of the ballroom, where men who had enjoyed the cruelty suddenly found their collars too tight. Alexander crossed the floor with the measured calm of a man who had spent years learning how not to show pain. But this was different. The insult had not been aimed at him alone. That he could have endured. He had endured worse in silence, with tea cooling beside him and invitations left unanswered on silver trays. But Lady Caroline had turned Emma's courage into a spectacle and offered it to the room as entertainment. That, something in him refused to permit. Emma stood very still, her silver locket hidden again beneath her glove, her bright eyes fixed on Caroline with a composure so lovely it almost broke his heart. She did not flinch. She did not shrink. Yet Alexander had seen the moment the word struck her. He had seen the quick tightening at the corner of her mouth, the small lift of her chin, the brave, beautiful habit of a woman who had learned to survive humiliation by refusing to make it visible. He knew that habit. He had lived inside it for 7 years. Caroline watched him approach, her smile growing uncertain only when he did not stop beside her. He passed her as though she were a draft from an open door and halted before Emma. The room held its breath again, but this time the silence was not curiosity. It was warning. Alexander bowed. Not the distant, efficient bow of a host. Not the cold gesture of a duke protecting etiquette. He bowed deeply, with public respect, before a young woman's society had just invited itself to mock. Emma's eyes widened. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you do not need to do this." "No," he said quietly, still bent before her. "I should have done it sooner." Then he straightened and turned toward the room. His scar caught the light. For years, that mark had been the first thing people saw. Tonight, for the first time, it seemed less like a wound than a seal upon a truth they had been too cowardly to read. "Miss Bennet did not lower herself by dancing with me," he said. His voice was not loud, yet it traveled to every corner of Whitmore Hall. "She raised this room by showing it courage." No one answered. Even Lady Caroline's diamonds seemed to lose their shine. Alexander continued, each word controlled, polished, and devastating in its restraint. "There are many forms of disgrace. A scar is not one of them. Poverty is not one of them. Honest work is not one of them. Standing beside someone who has been abandoned by fashion is not one of them." His gaze moved across the rows of frozen faces. "But cruelty dressed as amusement is. Cowardice disguised as good breeding is. And the habit of mistaking inherited comfort for moral worth is perhaps the oldest disgrace of all." A glass touched a table too sharply near the supper room. Someone drew in a breath. Lady Margaret, seated near the windows, lowered her fan with unmistakable satisfaction. Emma looked at Alexander as if she were seeing not the feared duke, not the wounded soldier, not the lonely master of a great stone house, but the man her father's unfinished letter had tried to name. Honorable, not because the world had praised him, but because he still chose decency when bitterness had every right to claim him. Caroline recovered enough to laugh, though the sound was thin. "How noble, Alexander. All this over a dance." He turned to her at last. "No, Lady Caroline. All this because you still believe a room becomes yours when everyone in it is afraid to contradict you." Color rose beneath her carefully powdered skin. "You mistake concern for cruelty." "I once did," he said. The words were soft, but they carried the weight of years. "I no longer make that mistake." Emma felt the entire ballroom shift around them. Nothing visible had changed. The chandeliers still burned. The orchestra still waited. The snow still pressed against the windows. Yet something old had cracked. A truth had entered the room and refused to leave. Alexander extended his hand to her, not as a rescue, not as a command, but as an invitation offered before witnesses. "Miss Bennet," he said, "would you allow me the honor of this dance?" The choice was hers. Everyone knew it. That was what made the moment powerful. Emma looked at his hand, then at his face, then at the scar that no longer frightened her because it never had. Her smile returned, bright and alive, touched now with something deeper than mischief. "I would be honored, Your Grace." When she placed her hand in his, the musicians began before he had to command them. This time, no one laughed. This time, when Alexander led Emma into the center of the ballroom, the couples near them stepped back not from fear, but from recognition. The waltz rose around them, graceful and solemn, and Emma moved with him as if courage had always known the steps. Alexander's hold remained proper, careful, but the distance inside him had changed. He no longer danced like a man enduring observation. He danced like a man remembering that he still belonged to the living world. And as they turned beneath the chandelier, Lady Caroline stood alone at the edge of the floor, watching the room she once controlled fall silent for a woman she had tried to shame. The second waltz altered Whitmore Hall more quietly than any scandal could have done. It did not change the chandeliers, the polished floor, the white roses arranged in crystal vases, or the snow pressing its pale hands against the windows. It changed the way people looked. Some lowered their eyes, not from fear of Alexander now, but from the shame of having stared too long and understood too little. Others watched Emma with reluctant fascination, as if courage were a language they had heard spoken for the first time and were embarrassed by their own illiteracy. Emma felt the difference. but she did not let it carry her away. She kept her steps steady, her expression warm, her lively spirit glowing beneath the formal grace of the dance. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything about her now, not in the shallow manner of a man admiring beauty at a ball, though she was beautiful enough to deserve every admiring glance the room had denied her. He noticed the way she held her chin when insulted, the way humor came to her like a lantern in a dark corridor, the way grief lived beside brightness in her without extinguishing it. When the music ended, he released her hand with visible care, as though haste might dishonor what had passed between them. "Thank you," he said. Emma smiled. "For the dance. For not leaving when it would have been easier." Her smile softened. "I have never been especially fond of easy things." Before he could answer, a voice spoke from the entrance of the ballroom, old, roughened by age, yet clear enough to cut through the renewed murmur. "Then perhaps it is time the room heard something difficult." Heads turned. An elderly gentleman stood beneath the archway, supported by a dark cane, his silver hair brushed back from a lined face that held the weathered dignity of someone accustomed to command. Alexander went utterly still. "Colonel Reeves," he said. The name moved through the crowd in startled whispers. Colonel Henry Reeves had not appeared in society for years. He had been one of the few men from the winter campaign whose reputation remained untouched, a soldier whose testimony had once been expected, then mysteriously withdrawn from public inquiry. His eyes moved to Emma, and the severity in them gentled. "You must be Dr. Bennett's daughter." Emma's hand rose to her locket. "Yes, sir. You have his eyes," the colonel said. "And, from what I have just witnessed, his inconvenient habit of standing where conscience tells him, not where comfort invites him." A faint ripple passed through the room, but no one dared laugh. Lady Caroline had gone pale. Alexander saw it. So did Emma. Colonel Reeves stepped farther into the ballroom, his cane striking the floor with soft, deliberate taps. 7 years ago, many things were said about Duke Whitmore. Most of them were convenient. Few of them were true. Alexander's voice was low. "Henry, this is not necessary." "It is long past necessary," the old man replied. "You have mistaken silence for honor, Alexander. Dr. Bennett never made that mistake." Emma's heart began to beat faster. Lady Margaret came to stand beside her, one protective hand resting lightly at her back. The colonel turned toward the guests as if addressing a courtroom rather than a ball. During the final winter of the campaign, a field hospital was ordered to evacuate ahead of a storm. The order came late. Too late. Several officers wished to save the official records and leave the medical tents behind until morning. A cold discomfort moved through the crowd. The colonel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Dr. Thomas Bennett refused to abandon the patients under his care. Duke Whitmore stayed with him. Not for glory, not for strategy, for decency. Together, they arranged wagons, found blankets, carried ledgers, lifted men who could not walk, and remained until every living soul who could be moved had been moved. Emma closed her eyes for a moment. Her father's unfinished letter seemed to breathe inside her memory. The colonel continued. The Duke's injury came that night, while helping the last wagon through the frozen road. Later, when questions arose about who had delayed the evacuation order, blame required a place to settle. A powerful family wished its son protected. Duke Whitmore allowed the inquiry to believe he had acted recklessly, because exposing the truth would have ruined a younger officer and shattered a mother already losing her husband. His gaze shifted to Lady Caroline. Some knew this. Some chose silence because a wounded hero was less useful than an unblemished marriage prospect. Caroline's lips parted, but no words came. Alexander looked not triumphant, but tired, as though the truth returning had opened a wound as much as cleansed it. Emma stepped forward. "My father wrote of this," she said, her voice bright no longer, but steady as candle flame. "He wrote that honor is not lost because cowards refuse to recognize it." A sound moved through the room, not gossip now, but reckoning. Colonel Reeves bowed his head. Dr. Bennett was right. Emma turned to Alexander. The ballroom, the guests, the scandal, even Caroline faded around the quiet force of that look. "You should have told the world," she said gently. "Perhaps," Alexander answered. "But I did not know how to ask the world to believe me, when the people closest to me had already chosen not to." Emma's eyes shone, though no tear fell. "Then let tonight be the first time you stop asking permission to be believed." The words struck deeper than vindication. Applause would have been easier. Praise would have been safer. But Emma offered him something far more difficult. A way back into his own name. Colonel Reeves turned to the musicians. Play something worthy of the truth. This time, the orchestra did not hesitate. The music rose slowly, not bright enough to erase what had happened, but solemn enough to honor it. No one spoke over the first notes. Whitmore Hall, which had spent years teaching silence to mean fear, now held a different kind of quiet, one that felt almost like prayer. Alexander stood beside Emma beneath the chandelier, while the truth settled over the room in layers no one could politely brush away. Lady Caroline remained near the edge of the floor, her face composed by force, her eyes lowered for the first time that evening. The women who had laughed with her now found sudden interest in their gloves, their fans, the frost on the windows. Gentlemen who had once repeated rumors with lazy confidence stared at the polished floor as if searching there for the dignity they had misplaced. Colonel Reeves moved to a chair near Lady Margaret, his duty done, his weathered hand resting atop his cane. Emma felt the weight of it all, not as triumph, but as a deep and aching release. Her father's name had been spoken aloud with honor. Alexander's had been returned to him in the house that bore it. Yet the man beside her did not look like a victor. He looked like someone who had carried a locked chest for so long that he no longer knew what to do when another hand opened it. "Your Grace," Emma said softly. Alexander turned to her. In his gray eyes, she saw gratitude, grief, exhaustion, and something fragile that had not yet dared to call itself hope. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For allowing your father's memory to remain hidden with mine." Emma's lively brightness softened into tenderness. "You were wounded too. That does not excuse silence." "No," she said gently, "but it explains the shape of it." The words moved through him with the quiet force she seemed always to carry. Around them, couples waited, uncertain whether to dance, leave, apologize, or pretend the evening had merely become unusual. Alexander looked across the room, past Caroline, past the old portraits, past the fearful elegance of the world that had judged him and then required proof to regret it. For years, he had imagined vindication as a door thrown open, a trumpet, a public restoration of all that had been taken. Instead, it felt like standing in candlelight beside a beautiful, brave young woman who had first believed him without needing evidence. He turned fully toward Emma and offered his hand. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice steady, though lower than before, "would you honor me with the last dance of the evening?" Emma looked at his hand. This time, the entire room knew the choice belonged to her. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even the snow beyond the windows seemed to pause against the glass. Her smile returned, bright as hearth fire after a long winter road. "Yes, Your Grace." She placed her hand in his, and the ballroom seemed to breathe again. The dance began. At first, they moved through a circle of empty floor, because no one dared intrude upon what felt less like entertainment than witness. Alexander's steps were controlled, graceful, and no longer burdened by the effort of pretending not to care. Emma followed him with natural ease, her cream gown catching the golden light, her chestnut curls glowing where they had escaped their pins, her green eyes alive with the beautiful defiance that had altered the course of the night. Slowly, other couples joined. Not all at once. Shame is cautious when learning humility. But Lady Margaret nodded to an old friend, and Colonel Reeves, smiling faintly, tapped time with his cane. A young officer bowed to a shy girl near the columns. An elderly husband offered his wife his hand. The floor filled by degrees, not with gossip, but with a gentler courage borrowed from the two people at its center. Lady Caroline watched until watching became unbearable. Then she turned and left through the side doors, her blue satin trailing behind her like the last color of an old mistake. Alexander saw her go and felt no victory in it, only release. Emma saw that too. "You are not pleased," she said. "No." His eyes remained on the dance, on the room, on the life that had begun moving again around him. "I thought I would be. Perhaps being free is quieter than being avenged." He looked down at her, and for the first time that evening, the smile that touched his mouth was unmistakably real. Small, solemn, almost astonished, but real. "You have a dangerous habit of saying things I am not prepared to hear." Emma's eyes sparkled. That is only because you have spent too much time with people who say nothing at all. A soft breath of laughter left him, and something in Emma's heart answered it. When the final notes approached, Alexander did not hold her closer than propriety allowed. He did not make a promise the room could devour. He simply bowed over her hand when the music ended, and this time, the gesture did not rebuild a wall. It opened a path. Your father would be proud of you, he said. Emma's throat tightened, but her smile stayed luminous. I think he would be proud of us both. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Whitmore Hall, covering the carriage tracks, the garden paths, the old stone lions at the gate, softening every hard edge without pretending the world had never been cold. Inside, the candles burned lower, but warmer. By morning, society would speak. It always did. Some would apologize. Some would revise their memories. Some would claim they had known the truth all along. But none of that mattered as much as the moment when a lonely duke stood beneath his own chandelier and was no longer alone, because one bright-hearted woman had crossed a room that fear had ruled for years and taught it to make way for grace. Some hearts are not healed by applause, nor restored by the world's late approval. Some hearts begin again when one brave hand reaches through the silence and stays.